that can be a good thing sometimes. So first I want to say that it's always a pleasure to be on the program with LaTanya. When I started work at the Census Bureau in 1998 was when her original work on re-identification was being passed around in folders inside statistical agencies saying, have you seen this? Have you seen this? Pretty much we made sure everyone had. So I also want to echo her sentiment that continuous improvement really made cryptography what it is today and allowed us to have confidence in transacting with our bank and the Social Security Administration and with the IRS in a way that we wouldn't have had the cryptographic standards not been subjected to the kinds of public scrutiny that got us to RSA and the various refinements to the public key, private key protocols that have proven so successful. I'm watching that happen now in fiscal disclosure limitation. And when we make these comments at various conferences that we need to put disclosure limitation through the same kind of continuous improvement cycle that gave us modern cryptography, you get an interesting comment. I'm basically going to quote Cynthia Dwork. She said, well, that's right. But remember that everyone wanted cryptography to work. That is, they wanted to make it possible for you to have confidence in the transaction between two commercial entities or your customer and a commercial entity, so that the great increment to wealth that is the modern information technology sector could occur. It is one of the principal enabling technologies. I don't think that disclosure limitation is in the same category. I don't think that the urgency that the cryptographers felt to solve the problem of cryptography, which basically gave rise to the protocol where everything is put in the public except the password, if you will, or the key to the random number generator, but everything else is public, and that allowed the kind of white hat and dark hat scrutiny of those algorithms to get them working. People like LaTanya, who have been working in this area as a white hat attacker, is making her attacks public and helping people improve their methodology. They exist in the disclosure limitation community. There's probably quite a few of them in the room. The people who are on the phone are identified as call-in user 106, call-in user 107, so I'm not really sure who they are. I look at the participant list. I know there's a lot of you in the audience, and your work is incredibly important to the statistical system. But it isn't generating the kind of continuous
mute on
system wants. And I think there's a very good reason for that. So here goes. LaTanya gave a lot of bad news, and I'm going to lead with a little bad news, even though Nancy Potok always urges me to lead with the good news. I'm going to get to the good news in a second. There was a big bang event in disclosure limitation in 2003. The database reconstruction theorem by Diner and Nassim proved that if you publish too many statistics that are too accurate from a confidential database, within a finite number of publications, you can reconstruct the confidential microdata to an arbitrary level of accuracy. A necessary condition to avoid the consequences of the database reconstruction theorem is random noise whose distribution is statistically independent of any of the other distributions that might be at work, a sampling distribution or a superpopulation distribution that you're using to model the underlying data. It's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition. But the fact that it's a necessary condition has been insufficiently appreciated in our attempts to modernize the disclosure limitation techniques that are used by statistical agencies. And I basically think the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking properly called us out on that. One of the reasons that our procedures for creating public use microdata sets and public use tabulations are so non-transparent is that we fall back on confidentiality to say that if we told you how we did this, our protections wouldn't be safe. Well, that's just flat out not going to fly anymore. As it turns out, we've already told you enough about how we did it to figure out that those protections probably weren't safe. We can't continue to ignore the consequences of the database reconstruction theorem. I shouldn't say ignore, that's too strong. We cannot continue at the rate of progress to address the concerns raised by the database reconstruction theorem at the rate at which we did during the previous 15 years since it was published. Some of the first things that were published after the database reconstruction theorem, the original differential privacy papers and other formal privacy papers, made an attempt to help disclosure limitation specialists understand what kinds of technologies would work here. We really do understand the mathematics a lot better now than we did in the first decade after the database reconstruction theorem was published. We understand, for example, that the discussion in LaTanya's first slide about privacy and utility is a discussion about technology. And basically what she was saying, which is correct, is that it's really easy to use an inefficient technology where you don't get very much privacy and you don't get very much utility. I'm an economist, so that's the last time I'm going to use utility for data accuracy, but it's the same concept. It's the same concept. If you want to get the most privacy for a given amount of data accuracy, you have to use an efficient algorithm. And in the technology of data publication systems, efficiency is not a constant. Just like in cryptography, efficiency was not a constant. Better algorithms are produced, and as those better algorithms are produced, you can have more privacy at a given level of accuracy or more accuracy for a given level of privacy. But all of those methods have common features that we have to acknowledge, and the biggest one is that those methods impose a global disclosure limitation risk measure on the entire publication process. Amongst the specialists, we call it a privacy loss budget. If you don't respect your privacy loss budget, your algorithms aren't safe. And how you establish that you respected your privacy loss budget is to publish your algorithms and to publish sufficient detail so that an external reviewer can confirm that those algorithms were run on the data. What is the immediate consequence of doing that? The immediate consequence of doing that is that any user can figure out the expected accuracy associated with those publications. That is to say, you can figure out the contribution to the margin of error that the disclosure limitation methods did. That's super important. It's super important because here comes the good news. What we started out to do in statistical agencies and what is still our principal mission is to publish reliable data. And reliable doesn't necessarily mean that this is exactly the data point that I collected from the respondent. Reliable means that the inference that you made using those data has the properties that you expect it to have. A t-statistic has the distribution that the t-statistic is supposed to have. The regression coefficient has the distribution that the regression coefficient is supposed to have. That hasn't been true for a long time in public use microsamples that have been released by statistical agencies. By how much the t-statistic or the regression coefficient deviates from the theoretical properties, to determine that, you have to know exactly what was done on the disclosure limitation. So you don't have the information necessary to do valid inference on the output data. Ian Schmuddy and I made that point in a paper that we published in 2015. We published it in an economics journal. I like to tease the statisticians by saying an economics journal will pay us $20,000 for that article. I haven't run into a stat journal that was prepared to do that yet. But to be frank, we didn't write that for the money, which was nice, but that's not why we wrote it. We wrote it because it was addressed at the user community economists who use the public use microsamples and public use tabulations produced by statistical agencies, and they needed to understand the limitations on analysis that are a part of the disclosure avoidance procedures. So if we make a commitment to publish inference reliable data, then we need to lead with that. We're trying to publish inference reliable data. And that means that on the privacy accuracy frontier, there's not just one sweet spot. Any point on that frontier is potentially a sweet spot. And I like to use an example that strikes all the way home at the Census Bureau. We publish the block level redistricting data every decade from the Census of Population and Housing, and we intend to publish the block level redistricting data again for the 2020 census, because those block level redistricting files are used to draw every congressional and legislative district in the country. So what's the sweet spot for accuracy? That's basically set outside the control of the Census Bureau. It's set by the Supreme Court's interpretation of the one person, one vote requirements of the Constitution. So the Census Bureau has never applied disclosure limitation to the population counts in those blocks. I mean, that's not a secret. If you read the properties of the public use files, PL 94-171, for every census that since the law mandated us to start producing those files, you will see that there's been no confidentiality and it's applied to the block level population. So if you try to implement a formal privacy system on top of a legal requirement that the block level population count should be exact, the analysis is a lot more subtle than most people realize. For starters, you can't just use the differential privacy definitions to say, okay, we're going to hold that constant, but we're going to add noise every place else, and enough noise so that we satisfy the differential privacy theorems. It turns out that if you expose the exact population count on each block, taking the census data as exact, which may not be exactly the right thing to do, but that is the way it's been treated by the Supreme Court, taking the census counts as exact means that it's actually impossible to protect the block level identifier at a level of formal privacy. That is, if you interpret the Constitution to require that districts be drawn with a level of precision that admits no error, or in California it's plus or minus 5 people, right? If that's the level of precision that's required, then you don't have any privacy with respect to the block level code. Now, that doesn't say that because the block level code is being exposed, everything else about you is known. Nothing else about you is known. But if I give you the population count and somebody knows that you live at a particular address, then those things that they can infer from the block level tables, they can infer about you. And so there needs to be formal disclosure limitation on everything else. And at a level of detail that I don't think we properly appreciated for a long time. So the use case for releasing block level redistricting data is extremely strong. It means that the sweet spot on the privacy accuracy frontier probably belongs way up on the accuracy. And certainly if you interpret the Constitution and the Supreme Court the way that they have been interpreted historically, it basically says that the block level identifier is in the public domain. I don't think that most people appreciate the consequences of that privacy analysis, but it's just math, and you can't repeal the math. So we have to learn how to protect our products in the face of formal mathematical analysis that tells us what things you can protect and what things you can't protect. And those things that we can protect and we are obligated to protect, we need to do as good a job of as the technology permits. There's a couple ways to do this. The example that LaTanya went through in some detail at the end of her talk is an example of how input noise infusion can fail, because that K-anonymous way of constructing those bar review or bar exam data didn't infuse enough noise at the record level. K-anonymity is just an aggregation technique, so you can think of it as publishing a whole bunch of really small cells. They didn't have any noise in them, and therefore they didn't really protect against re-identification or reconstruction of the underlying data. There are ways of doing that, and as LaTanya pointed out, if you're making a demand of public records, the provider of those records may not be allowed to add noise the way the theorems say you must. But that doesn't constrain statistical agencies, and I think that the statistical agencies need to start thinking hard about how to add noise and release the properties of that noise in a way that makes the microdata provably safe to a certain level of privacy loss, and documents the accuracy of the inferences that can be made to that level. And then you go to other access modalities, the last thing that LaTanya talked about, other access modalities like enclaves and data use agreements, but they don't completely solve the problem because you still have to figure out what's going to be published once the analysis has been conducted. And so you need a formal privacy model someplace in the publication system, and it needs to keep track of everything that's gone out the door in order to be sure that it has respected the privacy loss budget that it was given. For most of our agencies, though, output noise infusion makes more sense. We're already the trusted curator of these data, and output noise infusion generates, in a technical sense, more accuracy for a given level of privacy loss. And so most of the methods we should be exploring are output noise infusion methods. I think I'll end there, although I also remember what a 5 1/4 floppy is, in addition to a seven-track tape and other things that might challenge other people in the room, but not Bill.
Okay. That's for Sean. Thanks, John, and thank you, LaTanya. I think I'm going to start by asking LaTanya if you would like to respond to anything you heard from John.
Well, I think John was
Can I ask you to grab a mic? Thank you.
I think John and I are providing a unified front here, so I don't take exception. The only one thing I would say, two points I would make. One is somehow K-anonymity and what people call K-anonymity are totally two different things. So I just want to point that out. I don't think that's so important for this group, but if they had properly K-anonymized the data, it would have thwarted our privacy requirement. I can guarantee through a mathematical guarantee, but I think their utility would have been nil. So that's the problem with K-anonymity. What they call K-anonymity by choosing just a few fields that they chose is not appropriate. The other thing too that John said, he brought up Cynthia Dwork's comment about why encryption was different, and I would have you think very hard about data warfare. Our country, we also last year published a paper about election vulnerability, the use of the available data to impersonate voters. And a lot has been said about bots being used by other countries in order to persuade people. Some of the work that we had done when I was at the FTC is we know that when you look at websites that people visit, the first 10 websites, almost from any household, are roughly the same. They're Google, they're Facebook, and so forth. But then after number 10, as you go down deeper, it gives your demographics almost specifically, whether or not you have a child in your household, what your age range, your race, and so forth. It's not always accurate, but it's darn close. We also know from the FTC that real fraud, heavy, intense fraud, correlates to how much you feel you're in a group that's like yourself. That means that translates that people who go down those websites where there's a small group of the audience, they're the most prime for fraud, but they're also the most prime for manipulation and disinformation. And one of the ways we build trust is by being able to take publicly available information and public use files and being able to say, you can trust me because I know about this medical condition you have, or I know blah, 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 and impersonating other people to establish their trust. So I do think that these worlds are merging. The idea that the privacy issues on public use files and so forth, also Social Security numbers, is another area that it's merging towards. It becomes really important. And I don't think that, I do think that we'll get some potential to push pressure on the cycles.
Thank you, LaTanya. John hinted at something, LaTanya. I'm just going to ask you to speak to it before I open the floor for other questions. John talked a lot about, I think he used the phrase, the statistical agencies need to be thinking about how to release the properties of the noise. One of the reasons we're holding this conference that Joe organized, it was really to help us start thinking about what are the kind of metrics that we would want to produce to be transparent about the nature of our work. So I can just ask you to comment on that particular point for you. Step up from the mic.
I actually thought John did a great job of commenting on it, and also why it's been difficult to do. I don't really have anything more insightful to add to what he said. I thought he did that spot on. So I'm not going to add more time to it.
So let's open up the conversations in the room. I know it's late in the afternoon, but this is a good way to get your juices flowing, is to stand up and ask a question. Anyone in the room have something they'd like to ask LaTanya or John? I don't know if we can.
We've got one here.
Oh, great. Keenan, go grab a mic. You can come up here.
So I was confused by in LaTanya's talk. It really was a lot about using data that's available in the public domain that we have no control over, and we may expect someday people will stop putting everything about themselves up on Facebook, or we may expect them to keep putting more and more up on Facebook. But that seems like a variable that matters, but that we have no control over. And I feel like in John's comments, it wasn't. Was it that we just weren't even thinking about how those data affect the process? It was just simply controlling our own output, or was there a tie-in there?
It would be helpful to me if the question asker identified him or herself, because I can't see anyone.
Hi, this is Keenan Dworak Fisher from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Hi. The database reconstruction theorem talks about the reconstruction of the confidential microdata just using the data assets that were provided by the statistical agency in its publications. That's why I focused on it. The reason why reconstruction is a confidentiality risk is because most agencies, all the ones I know, don't release the microdata in the level of detail that they prepare. That is, the tabulation variables are more detailed than the public use microdata. But if you can reconstruct the tabulation variables and you already have the public use microdata, then re-identification attacks become much easier. LaTanya did an excellent job of showing why naive assumptions about how to prepare public use microsamples will be extremely difficult to defend against re-identification attacks. And the point I was trying to make is that some of the things that we do without relating it to our public use microsamples, specifically publish detailed tabulations where the tabulation variable is much more refined than the one that's on and its counterpart on the public use microsample. A good example is geographic coarsening. That is undermining our own attempts to create safe microdata, because the public use microdata are not operating in a vacuum. We're supplying the user with additional information about how to refine those public use microdata down to levels of the tabulation variables that we did not anticipate publishing at the micro level. That's what a database reconstruction is. And then you use that reconstructed database to do a re-identification attack.
I would just say two things. The first one is that re-identification, so people who are professionally doing disclosure limitation control or are providing these data sets are working very hard and doing the best that they can. And unfortunately, the climate is such that when you do a re-identification experiment, it's incredibly disruptive. People take it personally. It's very difficult on the individual in particular. And then part of that is because we have this draconian view that if it's in the public, it must be anonymous, as opposed to saying it has some risk, and now can I match that level of risk, or saying it has this amount of risk, so it can't be in the public, it has to be somewhere else with some other access. And because as long as we continue to do that, it is not the case that the public use files produced by government agencies are not vulnerable to these same attacks. Many of them are. I'm choosing purposely not to use them because of the disruption that it causes. But unfortunately, sometimes when you don't create that disruption, it creates that kind of conversation that I was showing with Yakowitz, meaning that, oh, well, then these are fine and the things that we're doing are fine. And that's not true. And so I'll stop there.
Thanks, LaTanya. I've had the privilege of hearing LaTanya and John have this conversation for a while, so this is all making sense to me, but I know for many of you, this is the first time. There's a lot here, so feel free to ask. There's no dumb questions. This is complicated stuff. So, and I know that I just said that and then Chris stood up, but I do not mean to imply that your questions are going to be dumb. I'm sure it's going to be great questions.
Thanks, Alina and Shelley. I'm used to you making comments like that around my questions. I don't know what I thought. Shelley, you yourself, you opened up the comments with a question. I'm up with that now. Are there extant and easily found sort of standards about what it is that the statistical agency should be producing that would allow people such as yourselves to evaluate whether or not our confidentiality protections are sufficient? Because at the end of the day, we're trying to produce, documents to the statistical agencies about what they should be reporting about how they put their data sets together, how they manipulate them, and how they rate them.
Well, I don't work in government anymore, so I can. But what I would say is we do have to. Transparency becomes really important. So in the space of I'm in the space of government decision making around what goes in a public use file or whether or not that public use file exists. Sometimes it's just totally anecdotal, and sometimes it's well thought out and extremely well done. And there's nothing right now that distinguishes those two. And so it becomes really important that it be a transparent process that says this is what was done to the data, not only for the reasons Sean pointed out, but also it'll force us to have a better craft. It'll bring up the bottom, and it'll also mean that if somebody then comes to you and says, here's this re-identification I just did, it's not an all or nothing. You don't have to freak out. You can say, okay, well, the next time we do this, we're going to include that information, as opposed to having to kind of pretend it doesn't exist. And so I think transparency of the decision-making is really important. Yeah, so, in the commission, the commission had some fantastic models. So one of the models in the commission was this idea that you publish the data and you also say how the data was redacted. You get to choose the detail so that if some of it has to be confidential, you can use the right words and so forth, but you do have to sort of provide it. If somebody then finds a vulnerability, there's a reporting system by which they would go through so that you would know, and therefore improvements could occur. Is that the part that you meant? Yeah. And so that was like this, it was just a great commission. There's a lot of fantastic things in that report. Others, Catherine. And that was one of them, because that one improves the craft for everyone, improves our scientific knowledge about how it's done, doesn't put anybody out on a limb, and allows the world just to get better.
Yeah. I asked LaTanya to mention that one because I particularly like that your view, LaTanya, continuous improvement. The gotcha is not really your preferred mode.
Yeah.
Continuous improvement is the better approach. Other questions? John, anything you'd like to add?
No, I got my chance to have my say.
Okay. Joe, how about you? Nope. Are we able to take questions from folks on the phone?
They should be able to unmute, yes.
Okay. All right. If anyone wants to, I think Wendy has a way to know it, so let her know. How many? Okay. All right. We are down to our last 10 minutes of the day, so I'm going to leave a couple minutes for Joe to do a wrap. Is that, you want to do that? Okay, but we still have a few minutes for questions. So, good. Oh, please. Sure. Come on up and make sure to say who you are, because John will want to know.
Hello, my name is Isaiah Rear. I'm at NCES. So I've seen disclosure avoidance plans at NCES, and there's a fictional character in them called the Data Sleuth. And this Data Sleuth is equally interested in everything, but there's no real scenario of what they might be interested in, why. And I was wondering if you, and so from the perspective of disclosure avoidance, we just assume that there are people out there who are infinitely curious. They don't actually have any other incentives. Do you have any more specific cases of why people would be, you had the case of maybe people would want to embarrass their lawyer colleagues or find out what their lawyer score is or GPAs, but do you have sort of specific threats driven by what the black hats would want to know in an education data set or a health data set?
Yeah, so there are two answers to that question. One is things that you'll never know, and two is things that are in the data set itself. So let me give you an example of things you'd never know. In one of the early examples I gave was the re-identification of the environmental health data from Silent Spring. So why is it important that those records not actually be re-identified? Because if there's been high cancer incidence in your house, your home value goes down. And so there's a financial loss for the world to know that it was your house that was in that data sample that had those readings, right? It also can be affect the actual, so like in lead poisoning too, it can also affect your ability or your children's ability to get insurance. So within that data set, that's really clear. But how do we re-identify it? We use tax assessor property data. Now, if you were sitting in the tax assessor's office, well, assuming you could redact, because they can't, that's just the nature of what tax assessor, that's part of how we do democracy. There's have to be some things that are clear to make sure that everyone's being charged a fair real estate tax, so we don't allow them to just not publish that data. But suppose they could publish that data. They would say, well, what's sensitive in the data? And they might think in terms of, well, the layouts of the houses might be sensitive because of security. You could do security threats. The amount of money a person, the fact that their mortgage is paid off may or may not be sensitive. They may come up with different things. But none of those things that would be sensitive in the tax assessor data were why we used it or affected the fields that we would use. In fact, the kinds of things I would come up with that are sensitive are totally excluded from the fields we actually use. So there's two sides of it. Is one, what's sensitive about your data, but then the flip side of it, which is why you get into these formal protection models for public data, these sort of mathematical properties, is because you can't really foresee what the harm, when yours is used for harm for someone else. So we could answer the game on education and health, but the points will still be the same.
Wendy, do we have any takers on the phone? They're silent. All right. Anyone else here? Okay. Let's thank our speakers again.
Thanks, all. Bye-bye.
Don't hang up just yet, folks. John's going to give us a goodbye.
Okay.